Hello there, Breffnie O'Kelly, buyer's agent here. If you're thinking about buying a property that has some bit of land attached to it, you're going to be very interested in today's episode because it's all about boundaries and certain questions we can ask to help us understand better the actual land we are buying and the perimeter of the land, the boundaries of the land we're buying. And today we're greatly chuffed to be joined by Sarah Sherlock. Sarah is a geomatics surveyor and she has in fact written many of the Irish and European survey standards in terms of boundaries. And going with today's episode is a very handy PDF that you can find in the show notes. And it gives you a guide of 16 questions to ask in terms of boundaries before you go sale agreed on a property, or maybe once you are sale agreed on a property. So the kinds of things Sarah suggests we look out for are if the physical boundaries on the ground actually correlate to the map boundaries as shown on the title map. Also, she'd be asking us to consider, are there any indications when you walk the boundaries of the land that other people have accessed portions of the land? Perhaps there's well-trodden fields, or perhaps there are gates or doors that might indicate other people have been going to and from over this particular stretch. She's going to also ask us to consider if there are any way leaves, e.g. maybe shared services, septic tank pipes going from your land to someone else's or their land to yours, etc. So there's eating and drinking in this particular chat, and I would certainly think if you're buying a property with any degree of land around it, you're going to get a lot of value from this. And certainly I'd suggest get out your pen and paper and take notes, because I did. Enjoy it, and thank you, Sarah Sherlock, for joining us. We're really delighted to have your expertise. So, Sarah, we are so lucky to have someone with your expertise on hand to talk through the whole issue of buying land or houses with land surrounding them. And I know you could and probably have written books on this subject, but what we'd love you to do is just think with us from an absolute layman's perspective. We've sat in the car, we've come down to a lovely house, we're charmed by it, we like the local village, we like the view from the house, there's land around it. Let's say, for argument's sake, there's 10 or 15 acres around this house. What if you were there with your sister who was thinking of buying this house, or I was your client and you were just coming along as someone who knows land? What would be the first thing you'd kind of look at about this land in terms of, is the sea, the rivers, the whatever, the height above? What would be your approach to looking at the land around a house?
Well, Breffnie, thanks very much for having me. And I'm not sure that I wrote any books yet, but I definitely have contributed to some standards and professional guidance in the area when it comes to property identification, demarcation and boundaries in Ireland and beyond. So I suppose the question you're after asking me is how long is a piece of string, really? The first question that I would ask is it a property that the client is interested in and willing to pursue? And if it is, well, then it's not mine to comment on, whether I like it or not. I have to look at it in an objective manner to make sure that their I's are dotted and their T's are crossed. So looking at it from a parcel identification, because ultimately the most important question for any client or anybody in a situation like that is to know what exactly is it that is being offered to them, and what exactly is it that they are likely to purchase should they go ahead. It's not uncommon that you would be handed a map and told, there you go. Or the other one that I love is where an agent comes out and you get the sweeping hand and it's everything that's included. But where does that stop? So the questions I will be asking is, what exactly is it and what is it not, more importantly,
Very good. Yeah, because sometimes you can assume when your eye can see this far that
yeah.
of course is included, when of course it isn't necessarily included. I suppose what I meant, and I totally take your point, and we'll get into the establishing what is it that you're buying question. Um, I'll give you an example of where I'm coming from a little bit with questions like this. I sometimes have people from America coming online and showing me a property that they've seen. And straight away, I can see that that property, when I Google it, is on a regional road, like the road has R beside it. And I can
Okay.
see that that house boundary goes very close to that R road. And I know that my American clients are looking for peace and quiet. So, but I can tell immediately that they're going to be on an R road or an N road, which is a national road, a busy road. And that's already making me think that might be a busy road. So that's already getting my antennae up a little bit versus if
Okay.
it was on an L road, say a local road. So that might be just one thing that when I see the property, I'm zooming into not just necessarily what's coming with the parcel, because we haven't got there yet. I'm just thinking in general, there's a big old river. Oh, what does that do when it rains? There's a road. That might be a bit noisy. There's a sea. How far does that sea come right up onto the land? They're kind of the helicopter view questions that I can sometimes look at on a map. Um, and
Breffney, as you ask all these things, going through my mind is I'm not aware of any one particular platform that would appraise everything that you're talking about right there. Many times you find yourself having to go to, say, for example, the OPW flood maps for information about your rivers. And when you're looking at your roads, you're looking at the National Transport Authority and they're published. Well, to be fair, though, Tálta Éireann National Mapping Division has all of our national roads well and truly documented. So you'll pick those up there, and that then transcends down into the property registration map. So you'll get a good handle on the road network for sure. But the subtler things like the high water mark or the low water mark, or what a river does, what's the likelihood for a once in 100-year flood, or any of that, it's highly unlikely you'll get all of that quality information in the one repository as such. So you're kind of looking at a situation then where you're pulling in all these various things that you want to look at to give a detailed property appraisal, and then you need to pull them all together. But the fundamentally important question in a situation like that is, when you're pulling them all in together, how are you pulling them in together to be sure that you're looking at them all in one neat package, that they are actually seamlessly working together and not conflicting with one another, or say, for example, you have the position misaligned or any of that. So there's important considerations there for anybody doing a technical due diligence in that respect, that maybe you mightn't be consciously aware of. So that's something you would want to be certain that when you're pulling in all these maps together, that they're working together in unison to give you the result that you want. Other things you might be looking at is like Irish water information. Is there a mains water pipeline? Is there sewerage outside the property? Is there an electricity line close by? Is it, or is there, say, for example, a high voltage overhead power line running through the property? Because ultimately, if there is things like that, that comes with its own set of circumstances, because it would be unlikely that you can start developing whatever way you like underneath that. There's lots of things. Then the other thing, I suppose,
can
none
I
of
just
us,
ask you, sorry, Sarah, about
yeah.
that, the high voltage line? Do they go underground ever, or are they overground?
Um, in certain circumstances, I do believe that they can be put underground.
Mm-hmm.
They're very visible overground for
Yeah.
sure. But in either way, it's not such a big issue because the ESB have very, very detailed property records. So something like that wouldn't go unnoticed. It
Okay.
would come up for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing that I would say to you, if looking at a nice country property, it's one thing to look at that property, but probably more important is to look at all the other properties around it, because there's no point in living in a beautiful country pile and having something next door that emits a horrendous smell, or, all kinds of things you could have. So we need to look at the property we're looking at, but equally as important is what's in the vicinity. And then
And
another
I'll share
important,
a horror story with you, if I may, about a friend of mine actually, who bought a cottage in the country and didn't realize that there was a good old planning application in for a wind farm. And so within a year of his having bought his lovely, peaceful cottage, he has a
a subtle hum.
all the time now. So I totally agree with you about this planning environment that you not only, well, I know you're talking about smells and whatever,
Mm.
also very important, but just actually how secure or stable is the planning environment that you land in, and how do we check that?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's two considerations there, and I probably hadn't thought about the one of that. Well, I didn't I wasn't implying it in the comment anyway. The one that I was talking about was the existing situation. But then, of course, you can have dotted all around the place a number of plans that have been submitted to a local authority previously and have received permission, but actually haven't issued a commencement notice or started their development. So therefore, you could buy into this beautiful sprawling green space and have a live application next door that could potentially become a real thing in the not too distant future. If you
So
don't do your planning checks, so they need
exactly,
to be
and
done.
these planning checks can be done by lay people, which
Yes,
is
of course.
yes. And so, how would you suggest they do that?
They
If
should
they're
contact the relevant local authority and go into their planning office and see, what exactly is lodged, what's in there, what has a valid grant of planning, or what maybe is under appeal, or, another important thing for somebody to look at is if they are purchasing a property, like say, for example, you've 15 or 16 acres down the country, and depending on the property or the situation or what's envisaged for it, they may have some plans to do some development themselves. But if, for example, there has been a number of planning rejections on the site, you should also look for that, because it would impact what you might be able to do. So
really good point.
that's another important consideration for somebody to be consciously aware that what's there needs to be interrogated. You need to look at it and see how the property has been, like, what were the intentions previously by the past owners, because not everybody will disclose that information might not always be disclosed through the conveyancing process in its entirety. Um,
And
then
may I just comment, if anyone's listening to this and they're living outside of Ireland, you don't always just have to go to the local planning office in the county that the property is in. There, you can search online for these planning applications, which is really brilliant.
for sure, and since the introduction of my plan, you can definitely access them. But just to be certain, you can only do so much, but then you should definitely make a final check, because there are some historical files that won't be on my plan, and you don't want to get caught out in that respect. Okay. Then the other things that you would be looking at, I suppose, if you're coming to the countryside, is schools. What schools are in the area, what other services, utilities. One consideration that I've seen somebody getting caught out with and been a little bit miffed. There's no local bin collection in an area where they were going to. So certain things like that. If you're looking, you might want to delve into that, of
And
course.
the Wi-Fi as well. What's doable? What kind of Wi-Fi coverage and what's being rolled out in your area?
Well, I think that becomes more pressing depending on the age of the occupants in the house. The younger they are, the less likely they are to tolerate any poor notion of Wi-Fi at all.
Exactly.
Um, you might have a very unhappy family if you had no Wi-Fi.
For sure.
Yeah. Then coming back to it, there's multiple different types of surveys then that you would be looking at if you were purchasing a
Yeah.
property. I just will, on this juncture, say that the Society of Chartered Surveyors has approximately 13 different types of surveying disciplines. So that's a lot of surveying, and it's not all boundaries. It covers the entire of land, property, and construction. And depending on the property and your intention, it might be necessary for you to get opinions from a number of those, not just one. It would be unlikely that one would cover all of the disciplines without drawing in some expertise from the other disciplines. I suppose one of the most fundamentally important one is the building survey itself.
Yeah.
If there's a property, the building surveyor will do that, and they will look at things like the fabric, the use, your future intentions. Is it possible? What's likely? The maintenance of the property, the longevity of everything that's there, and what you're likely to have to spend to give it what you need. So there's
And for
lots of work.
anyone Sorry,
Yeah,
Sarah. And for anyone who's listening to this, in the show notes, I'll link to just an article I've done about surveys with some sample surveys of properties, just your standard physical property survey for people just to have a look at. And as you say, Sarah, you can add and subtract to it in multiple ways, depending on what you're interested in doing with this property or the age of the property. But at least just as a basic to get the ball rolling, I will have one or two surveys for people to look at, just for structural surveys.
yeah.
Sorry.
And then that brings me back into the thing that, the building survey will look at things like the structure, the roof, all of these major components that you have to give consideration to if you're going to purchase. Then you have planning and development. So they will look at the planning questions, and what it is that you're planning on doing, if anything at all, and how likely it is to work. Depending
And
on
when,
the age of the property as well, Breffnie, it might be worth some of your clients considering getting advices from a conservation professional,
yeah,
because if it's a historic property or a traditionally built property, it will have different needs and demands to that of a newly built property. And only somebody with the relevant expertise would be likely to guide them in the correct direction, and have the familiarity required to have confidence in the advices that they're giving.
exactly. For example, I had a client who was buying a Georgian building and there was a radon issue with it. And before we ever did the radon survey or checked it for it, the expert was able to tell me if it's got this kind of a subfloor, we're in business. If it's got that kind of a subfloor, we've got a big lot of work to do in order to remedy this situation. And just even knowing that I was dealing with someone who was used to dealing with the historic property versus a modern property and knew what issues were likely to arise with this historic one, I found it really reassuring that he knew what the fix was for this and for that. So even when you're hiring your expert, it's great if they can also share with you that they have a knowledge or an understanding of the property type. They may be an expert in the subject matter, but are they an expert in your property type as well? Is it a good fit?
Yeah, and like another important aspect there that might be missed by somebody who doesn't have familiarity with historical properties is the types of funding that may be available for your property if it's on the record of protected structures, for example. So you can be penny wise but extremely pound foolish if you don't get the right advice from day one.
Mm-hmm.
Then other things that you would consider, you might need the advices of an electrical engineer or the likes to have a look at your electrics if there's any issues over a certain age, but then that'll come back into the conservation side of it as well.
Yeah.
The other thing that regularly catches out people when they're purchasing properties is the underground services and utilities, because we don't see them. So they're out of sight, they're out of mind, and you don't know you have a problem till you put on an extra 3 rooms, and then you realise all the underground pipes might have to be upgraded or whatever. So there's lots of hidden things that we need to be conscious of and aware of when we go looking at properties.
Or the septic tank has, planning permission for X number of rooms or bathrooms and not Y number of, if you want to add on a couple of extra bathrooms. And the things like city livers who live in a serviced or who live in a luxurious enough home in another country don't consider the fact that very often rural properties in Ireland will not have their own water supply and they won't have their own sewage system. So they'll be working with the septic tank and they'll be working with well water. And sometimes the drains, as you say, are old and they're Victorian and they're maybe a bit wrecked as well. So you might want to do a drain survey. You might want to get your water tested. You might want to have someone, very often the surveyor who's doing the structural survey will have a look at the septic tank as well and just see, well, what kind of shape does that look like it's in? And is it even in the right position? Sometimes you realize the septic tank is located above the house for whatever crazy reason, and there's no drainage to the house, all sorts of odd things, or the septic tank's located on the brother's land, not
And
the
that's
land that
probably
comes
the
with the
most
house,
famous Irish one. The
isn't
septic
it?
tank is out over the hedge where nobody thought about it. It's not included with the plot. Then when you want to do something, you have to go and, well, obviously you can continue with it the way it is probably, but if you want to do any works with it, it mightn't be yours to decide whether you can or not. You might have to go out and get the permission of the neighbour or, who was initially the father-in-law, or whoever,
Yeah.
the family member, that there was no problem when it was within the family, but now that it's been sold to another, might not be as welcoming of the idea of additional works happening on their property.
Exactly. And
So
I
you
think
can
it's worth knowing for the person buying the property, the selling agent may be aware of some of these things, but they may well not be aware of many of these things, because very often when the selling agent goes out to take a property on for sale, they have a nice cordial chat with the person who owns the house. And it's kind of a selling chat. So they're selling themselves. And now the deal is done. Great, we've got this property to sell. Now we do the paperwork, which is the selling agent sells the contract with the homeowner. But even at this stage, it's all a little bit delicate and tender. So the selling agent doesn't necessarily ask the seller, well, have you got planning permission for that massive extension you've built? Have you got planning permission for that septic tank that looks like it's in your neighbor's field? The agent is still kind of in a tender enough relationship with the seller. So it's really, as a buyer, you're buying the house, but you also need to have an eye to the relationship that the selling agent has with the seller, as in how much information have they got from that seller, and how robust a relationship do they have with that seller, so they can actually start getting that information from them early enough in the procedure so that they can pass it to you and really allow you have access to all this information up front, like such as the boundary map, the map that you are likely to get. Because very often when a selling agent puts a property on for sale, they show nice photographs of the house and the land, but we don't at this point know what is the actual map of the land that comes with the property. And very often the selling agent themselves don't know, but ideally, let's say they do. In this case, let's say we are presented with some kind of a map, Sarah. How should we approach this map if a selling agent...
even if you are presented with a map, the fundamentally most important questions that you need to ask is who prepared it, when was it prepared, for what purpose was it prepared,
Hey.
how was it prepared, and have any changes occurred since it was prepared to the property now? Because if you're answering any of those, I always say Kipling, who, what, when, where, how, and why, your questions, they're the essential questions. If you don't answer those, ask them to have them answered, well, you can be in an information deficit where you're taking something at face value and it might not be that. Like, it's not uncommon where a map could have been prepared for a property a number of years ago, but nothing has really changed around the property. But yet they've put in a new fence, they've done a bit of landscaping, they've upgraded the entrance or whatever. Is that caught on the new map? Those things usually go unnoticed. And I will say, based on my experience to date, they normally never become known until the week before drawdown or the week before contracts are due to finalise a close. I mean, that's when they become the problem. But they don't need to become the problem at that stage, because this stuff, it should be done. Well, I don't know, is it for the purchaser to do or is it for the vendor to do? And that's very much a relationship that they have to work out between them, but one of them needs to do it at this particular juncture when the property is now for sale, to be certain that that map that you have is still correct and what it is. Now, maps and mapping, when it comes to property, to give you that degree of certainty, like during this kind of dating phase where we're all, are we buying? Are we selling? What are we buying? What are we selling? All this negotiation phase, everything's lovely there. But, at some stage we have to have commitment. What exactly is it, And for that general discussion, your large scale national topographic mapping. Then the other thing, if you look in the consumer guidelines, it triggers multiple questions down along it that you end up with surety as to what you have. And a wonderful question in that consumer guideline that everybody should be extremely conscious of. You may have title maps from before, you may have a ground truth survey done from 10 years ago and everything was fine. But a question in the guidance or in the consumer guideline is, have any changes occurred to the boundaries since the title map was created? And if so, what are they, right? So it really forces the situation where somebody would have put in a brand new fence. it gets clarity around that, that this was put in at this time, it was put back in the exact same place, or it was put back on the same alignment. Those kind of things become evident for you. Recently enough, I worked on a property where it was abutting a former stretch of a canal. It's now closed, but we could find the original fencing from the Grand Canal Company, the the
Fabulous.
cast iron
Yeah.
uprights, and you could see where the new uh, timber post and rail fence followed the exact same alignment. But that question would be bottomed off.
Mm.
Changes have occurred, a new fence went in, but it's not a material change because it followed the exact same
Mm.
alignment. So they're the kind of things you should be doing. I'm always amazed when not a surveyor, but anybody comes out to a site to verify the boundaries, and they just have a piece of paper in their hand. They don't get behind the stuff, but yet they're able to come away saying everything's fine. How would you know? You have to get in there. You have to look behind. You have to walk along what it is, the external perimeter of it, because in every reality, those areas generally are not any, unless it's a brand new property, right? Or it's a property that has been completely looked at for the purpose of having all these questions never become a problem and it's regularized. But the majority of properties, what you have is a mixture of things all the way around the external perimeter. You'll have a bit of a fence, you'll have some hedging, you'll have maybe a bit of a wall, you'll have maybe the neighbour's shed, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So boundaries are always comprised more or less of multiple things. And
Yeah.
what you're trying to find out is, what are they? Who owns them? And how do they affect what you can do with yours in the future?
Yeah.
And it's good practice to get yourself a good photographic survey as well. So that map that you have, it would be well wise for anybody to turn around and take photos along the external perimeter of it and document what the physical features are and have it confirmed by the vendor that that is what it is that you're buying and how they've used it.
Okay, so say we're as you say, we're past the dating phase of our house. We like
Yeah,
it, and we've figured out all our questions about the house and the water and the septic tank, etc. And now we're looking at our boundaries, and we've been given this piece of paper, which is as you say, probably the folio map that comes with
yeah.
the property. And your questions are so valid, which is, what changes were made since that was. And then you are suggesting getting a ground truth survey done. And Sarah, who would do such a survey for us?
Well, just to come back there, the one word that everybody, no matter who they are, probably would attempt to answer is, what is a boundary? Everybody knows what it is, and they'll give you some kind of an attempt of an answer, right? But in reality, when we're talking about property boundaries, they're made up of a couple of different components. A boundary is not just one thing, because you have to check the settled boundary on the ground, the paper on title, and then, if registered, Táilta Éireann land registration map. So a boundary is actually three things
Things,
there. So
right.
don't ever just check one thing, because you'll be left, it's a three-legged stool. It won't stand on one. You need all three, right? So just be awfully conscious of that for you and your clients, that if you're talking about boundary and its property, it is three things most likely that you're talking about. And what you need is all three things to stack up and say the same thing within tolerance. Okay.
And Sarah, sorry, just to say, when we spoke before, you made a really good point, because maybe at this point, people listening will say, oh, for goodness sake, like, we're buying, we don't really care. Like, we don't really care if it's an inch in or a meter in. We're buying a lovely country home, and it's much of muchness to us whether the boundary is here or there, so long as that hedge stays or whatever. And, that could well be the thinking in someone's mind when they're buying a property. Like, I don't much really care whether we've got 2 feet or, but you said to me before in a conversation, which I thought was so useful, a thought about insurance, in that getting this really clear right now
Yeah.
is like paying your insurance into the future for like, it may be very well you mightn't care too much today whether you've got a meter here less or a meter here more, but you really will care if you start to see someone arriving up one day with a digger and a couple of fence posts to put a new gate somewhere that you thought was yours, and it doesn't take much space to create a gate. So I liked your idea that, I'm only saying this now because a lot of people who have, when the blood is up and they like a property and they're ready to go and their money's up front and what the hell and who cares, they might think, well, what's the point in getting all this? It doesn't really matter to us. But you're saying it may not matter today, but if you don't know the information, you might be in with this shock in the future. So by
Sure.
not overlapping these three layers and making sure they are in sync, you could be in for a shock.
Absolutely. It's like that age-old adage where the day you buy is the day you sell. And I once spoke to a property developer, and I still laugh at what he said to me. He said, Sarah, I've never once bought a piece of ground that I didn't have to buy another bit or sell a bit or sort out a bit, because there was always something wrong with it by the time I went to get rid of it. So what you want to do is know what you're taking in day one, so you can get rid of it whenever that day comes. But a good ground truth survey and a boundary survey is really like an insurance policy. If all those three things stack up, well, you know what, chances are it's dead enough money because you're not going to get much from it. It's there, it's a benign thing. But say, for example, something does happen and you do have it, well, then you have all the information that you require to more or less weed out a boundary issue to within a couple of 100 millimeters. You're not going to have any major things coming out to bite you. They'll be resolved. You'll have had the clarity day one. So, it depends. I suppose the question for the client is, are you risk adverse, or do you want to turn around and just take the chance?
Yeah.
And if you take the chance, so be it.
Yeah.
Be what may. If the neighbour comes out and you have a new entrance, well, you
Laneway.
have a new entrance. You'll deal with it then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely. Just to come back to your question, who would do it? There's a number of really good boundary surveyors in the country. The majority of them would be known as land surveyors as well, or geomatics surveyors. There's engineers who carry out this work for sure. I do believe there's some building surveyors, but the majority of those practicing in the area of boundaries are all geomatics or land surveyors. The SCSI has a website, and on it you can go to find a professional, and they have listed in there their chartered geomatic surveyors, and Engineers Ireland also have a number of others of their members who would be inclined to carry out this work as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the whole area of surveying for the lay person is amazing. That the language around it is quite interesting, in that some people say, well, we need to get an engineer out to look at that property.
Yeah.
And what do they mean? And you really don't know. They usually don't mean an engineer, actually. They usually mean we'll get a surveyor out to look at that property, or we'll maybe get a builder out to look at that property. But people use words and surveyors and words like engineers and surveyors quite interchangeably, and they're not always clear what they mean. And I'm not always clear what they mean when they say it either, because they may say engineer, whereas in fact they mean structural surveyor.
Well, I don't think that needs to be a question, to be honest, because if you go to Táilta Éireann land registration mapping guidelines, Appendix A, Section 2.2b, it clearly states that maps and mapping for the purpose of registration should be compiled by competent land surveyors. So why we're having any doubt as to who you really should be going to verify and validate your boundaries is beyond me. But I do understand why an architect is normally asked for this, or an engineer. It's down to the standard forms of contract. They seem to be specified more liberally than surveyors would be. And then, as I said, you can specify a surveyor, but if you don't specify what type of surveyor, well, there's 13 there to choose from. So you're not going to get an arts and antiquities surveyor to confirm your boundaries. Do you know what I mean? So there's it's horses for courses. But when it comes to boundaries, I don't think there's any doubt as to who you should be getting. And like, a good boundary surveyor will be able to help you with many of those other things that we're talking about. Because remember, we spoke about lots of different maps, be they for flooding, be they for overhead lines, be they for services and utilities running through your property. Most of that information they can collate and present to you in a manner that you will find it easy to digest it and use it and work with it, you know. So there's merit in definitely contacting a boundary surveyor to help you with some of these questions.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Given that the mapping is not always at the same scale, so they'll know how
Yeah,
to interpret the overlay. Um,
exactly.
Fantastic. So, Sarah, in terms of just the physically walking the boundaries, what are issues that you have come across? Like, one of them say might be rights of way. What might be kind of indications to us if we're walking a boundary that there might have been a right of way here, or there potentially is there anything that might raise our hackles?
I'm laughing because it brings to memory one day that I was walking along a boundary, and I think it's the closest I ever came to having a heart attack. I was walking, like, as I say, I always would stick my head in and have a look and be sure. And if the neighbour wasn't adverse to it, I would walk it from the other side as well, because what you see on one side is not generally the same as the other. So in situations where you can inspect it from both sides, absolutely, that's should be done. But anyway, I remember a lady contacted me. She had a major boundary issue, and anyway, we walked along her garden and down to the bottom of it, and there was this lovely door, and I posted it on LinkedIn. Actually, I can send it back to you. I can send you a link to it. But there was this lovely door presented at the end of the garden, and I said to her, "There's a door." She said, "Oh yeah, that's a mass path." And I was like, "Oh my goodness!" Like, you know, some people would put a door at the end of the garden because
As
you
a
want to
feature,
hide
maybe.
something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Hide
yeah,
a
yeah,
shovel or a
yeah,
spade or something.
yeah, yeah,
Next thing we launch into a mass path, and I'm
yeah.
like, oh my goodness, that's probably the worst possible thing you could say to me, because this is presented nowhere. So that in itself has multiple different considerations that you'd have to think about. But yeah, the things you'd be looking for, if you are walking along a property, for certain you need to be checking, is is it all presenting similarly, or is it presenting differently? If it's presenting differently, is some of it looking like it's in use? Because if an area looks like it's trodden and worn down, well, then chances are there's either something or someone coming through it. And your question is, what is it? Who is it? Have they rights to be doing it? You know, how long is it for? Because if somebody's doing something like that for long enough, well, that can have lead to its own problems, you know. So
Mm-hmm,
what you want to be doing is going along the entire of it and asking, and don't be afraid to ask, because
mm-hmm,
one of the biggest problems is people don't ask, they
mm-hmm,
don't get the assurances, and then sale has closed, vendor's gone, and you're there picking up all these questions that you can't answer because you don't have the familiarity.
mm-hmm.
So ask the ones that are there and in occupation of it. Um, Other things to look out for, like, now it wouldn't apply to a large country property as such, but it would apply in an urban area where you have what looks to be a boundary wall, but you have an eaves or a gutter coming down and sitting on top of the wall on your side of it, or possibly draining into your property. You know, these are the things you need to be looking for. Um, when you look at a boundary, it's a definitive line from heaven to hell, generally, unless it's a multi-story type registration or a multi-type ownership. And what you need to do in that instance is have a very benign look at everything you're doing. You're walking along it and you're checking up and down, and anywhere there's a penetration through that, you need to know what it is, why it's there, who's doing it. And back to the Kipling questions, you do those, you won't have a problem.
Really interesting. And also, just in terms of, I'm thinking of two kind of boundary issues I had recently with them clients buying properties. One was a property in the south side of Dublin, and in terms of things that might have risen, made your hackles rise or make you ask a question, there was a lovely old stone wall along a lane. And I noticed that the stone wall had a kind of a topping along it, that in a certain spot. And we were just asking about that. Anyway, it turned out that the person who was selling the house to us had actually gone out into the, had seen fit to to go take his boundary wall out into the lane and reclaim maybe a meter, so a meter wide and a couple of meters long along this lane for his own reasons. So when we saw the house, we saw a lovely garden with a rockery, but actually if we were to draw that line legally, that rockery didn't come with the property. It was on the other side of the wall. And it was just the new topping on the lane, on the wall, that kind of alerted us to ask the question. And another one was where the agent was telling me that the seller this was on the land of the original family farm, this house that they were selling. And it turned out that the mapping had been done incorrectly. But the very fact that he knew that this house that we were buying was on land that was originally part of another parcel of land that came with another house alerted us to the fact that there might be a recent mapping issue, because something had happened since that map was drawn. And what ended up happening was that it had all been incorrectly mapped and the whole thing needed to be remapped. So it's just, you never know exactly what it is you're looking for, but it's a bit like Hercule Poirot going along. You're looking for something unusual, as you say, an indent in the ground or a gate or...
Yeah, and not even that. Another property I worked on, I remember tearing my hair out because there was like, it was an urban garden, but it was all walled. There was like cut limestone wall, so it wasn't an insignificant wall. It was quite
Beautiful.
well built. It was substantial, and the title definitely extended further, much further. But it was very, very clear from visiting the property that it couldn't have been any of that, because they would have had to get an aerial drop to get in and out, So after doing all of our surveys and our overlays, I had multiple questions at the end of it. And then it was only, not all of the title deeds had been sent over, just some of them. And when I was insisting that there was something very much the matter, other documents became apparent or were sent over. And when I went through them anyway, here in just a really innocuous little clause down at the end, there was a commitment that a new wall would be built in the exact same manner and style as the remainder. I was like, well, that's the wall they're talking about. It can be nowhere else, because it clearly showed the rest of it. So, when you do your checks and you go through things, and that's why it's important to have a land surveyor do, because they will do their new survey at a scale that picks up all of this, that when they pick up the other maps, they can have confidence, like they can go back and take their feet and inches and scale it and know what it is in relation to it. Because if we're relying on national topographic mapping at a scale of 1:1,000, every millimetre on that map is a metre on the ground. You know what I mean? So we're starting to accumulate.
Yeah.
So we're looking at minute things. We need to be doing more detailed surveys.
And what detail would that happen at? What detail would that survey?
Well, like if a wall is only 300 mil thick, you're not going to see that on a map.
No,
at a scale
but
of
on this
1:1,000.
map that we are commissioning now, we're doing
Well,
exactly as you suggest.
Yeah, you would probably have your ground truth survey depicted on a map at a scale of 1:100. So you'll pick
1:100. Okay, yeah. Lovely.
So you'll have plenty. Actually, I've quite a. This is a story from a survey I did not too long ago, where I had two farmers, and I said to them, guys, listen, you have a wooded area. It's quite clear that we're going to be sitting here for a long time bickering over millimeters this way, that way, and the other way. And in every respect, does it really matter? And they both agreed that it didn't. And I said, well, once you're both of that opinion, can we buy a couple of stakes and bang them into the ground, and you both agree what you're going to abide by for the rest of your time? And they both said, okay, grand. So we got a couple of stakes, then we got a can of spray paint, and we dotted it all along the side of it and down along it, and we created a new boundary agreement map. And anyway, one of them had recently got another map from when he acquired the property. And he came to me and he said, God, that map you have, it's a horror great map. You'd know exactly what's what like. And I said, right. And he said, so then he pulled out the other map he had and he said, you wouldn't have a clue with this yoke. And I said, well, that's the idea of a boundary agreement map. The idea behind the boundary agreement is that you're never going to have a disagreement in the future because the two of you are crystal clear as to what it is you have and do not have. So they were laughing, but that is the idea. That's the way maps and mapping should be. That's the way property should be. It can be clear. The only reason it's not clear is because we're all flustering around with these maps, afraid to bite the bullet and say, come on, let's get the survey done, let's get the clarity, let's work with it and move on. Like there's a time and a cost for everybody in not getting it done because
Yes.
you're going around in this grayness and it could be this, it could be that. No one can make a decision. There's almost paralysis. Whereas if you turn around, get the work done, yes, it's a difficult pill to swallow. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, there's a bit of time in it. But guess what? When it's all done, you never do it again.
Well, it makes such a lot of sense, such a lot of sense. And I mean, it makes me think there that not only are you getting certainty in terms of your boundaries, but you also are, to some extent, future-proofing your relations with your neighbors too, because you're really clear about what it is you own and what it is you have title to.